Before we begin this thrilling and engaging radio broadcast, we have a small request. Please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the Voicecast for more captivating broadcasts like this one. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, what are you doing right now? Where are you from? And what time are you watching this? We'd love to hear from you. Now get comfortable, relax, and prepare yourself as we dive into tonight's chilling journey. Let's begin. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. DisneyLand, a place synonymous with joy and wonder, has become the epicenter of an unthinkable disaster. What started as an ordinary evening under a canopy of fireworks has erupted into chaos. Moments ago, reports flooded in of an escalating situation in the park's western quadrant. Sirens now wail through the air, punctuating the terrified screams of guests caught in what is being described as a violent disturbance. Emergency announcements are blaring, urging guests to evacuate, yet confusion reigns. Families clutching their children flee in every direction, their faces etched with panic. What could cause such terror at the happiest place on earth? We'll take you deeper into the unfolding nightmare. But first, heed this warning. Stay tuned, stay informed, and above all, stay safe. Just hours ago, Disneyland was alive with magic. Laughter rang out from the spinning teacups, and the sound of marching bands filled the air as families gathered for the evening parade. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Witnesses described the eerie shift. A woman collapsed near Adventureland, convulsing as horrified onlookers gathered around. Minutes later, chaos erupted. Guests began screaming, running from what they could only describe as people turning feral. Medical personnel rushed to the scene, but the chaos escalated too quickly. Eyewitnesses recount seeing workers struggling to contain violent outbreaks among the infected. Panic surged through the crowd like a tidal wave, turning joy to fear. As night fell, Disneyland was no longer a beacon of happiness, but a battlefield against an unseen enemy. How did it happen so quickly? What triggered the madness? The answers remain as elusive as the danger itself. The terror began subtly, hidden among the usual park buzz. Initial reports describe people staggering, disoriented, then becoming violent without warning. As the infection spread, the western quadrant of the park descended into pandemonium. Witnesses say the infected exhibit unnatural hunger, attacking others with no regard for their own safety. Amid the chaos, a new threat loomed. This wasn't just panic. This was something far worse. Authorities have yet to confirm the source of the outbreak, but the infected multiply faster than anyone could imagine. Whatever this is, it thrives in the shadows and waits to strike. Authorities are scrambling to understand what could cause such rapid devastation. In just under an hour, Disneyland has transformed from a place of dreams into a nightmare. The infected move erratically, but their behavior seems deliberate, almost coordinated. Emergency medical teams are overwhelmed, and containment efforts appear futile. Could this be a rare illness, a mutation, a biological attack? No answers have emerged, only speculation and fear. The question remains, can anyone escape this nightmare alive? Keep listening as we uncover the truth. Time is running out, and the story is far from over. Authorities now believe the nightmare began innocently enough, with a shipment of exotic plants destined for the Adventureland jungle expedition. These plants, imported from remote corners of the world, were meant to bring a touch of untamed beauty to Disneyland's lush displays. But hidden within the foliage was something far more sinister. Scientists have traced the outbreak to a mutated fungal spore carried by one of these plants. A spore that, according to preliminary reports, may have jumped species to humans. The first signs of danger went unnoticed. Maintenance workers unpacking the shipment remarked on the plant's strange, almost iridescent sheen. One worker, now identified as Patient Zero, pricked his hand on a thorn while setting up a display. He brushed it off, unaware of the microscopic terror spreading through his bloodstream. Within hours, he collapsed during a park performance, convulsing as stunned guests looked on. What seemed like a medical emergency soon spiraled into something unimaginable. The infected man rose with unnatural aggression, attacking those closest to him. This was the beginning of a chain reaction that would turn Disneyland into a living nightmare. Who could have foreseen that these beautiful plants would harbor death? And worse, how far could the infection spread before it was too late? Patient Zero, the term we use for the first infected individual, was a maintenance worker known for his meticulous care of Disneyland's attractions. On the surface, his injury seemed trivial. A small thorn prick, no deeper than a paper cut. Yet within moments, he reported dizziness, a racing heart, and an overwhelming sense of heat. Park medics tended to him briefly before he insisted he was fine. Hours later, during a performance in Adventureland, he collapsed in full view of dozens of park guests. Witnesses described the scene as terrifying and surreal. The man, writhing on the ground, emitted guttural sounds before falling eerily silent. Moments later, he rose, his eyes unfocused but his movements deliberate. He lunged at a nearby performer, biting and clawing with animalistic force. Panic spread like wildfire as people screamed and fled. Security arrived, treating it as an isolated violent incident. But by then, it was far too late. Everyone Patient Zero came into contact with began to show symptoms within minutes. Fever, aggression, hunger. This was no ordinary illness. It was a chain reaction of terror that no one could stop or even fully understand. Disneyland, known for its packed attractions and vibrant energy, became the perfect breeding ground for the outbreak. With tens of thousands of guests crammed into every corner of the park, the infection spread at an unthinkable speed. Eyewitnesses described seeing infected individuals suddenly turning on their loved ones. A mother attacked her child in the line for Pirates of the Caribbean. A teenage boy collapsed near the churro stand, only to rise moments later and attack a stranger. Infected guests, seemingly driven by an unnatural hunger, began lashing out indiscriminately. The park's design, meant to channel crowds through tight pathways, worked against them. Crowds became bottlenecks, making it impossible to flee without brushing against the infected. The illness didn't discriminate. It leapt from person to person, fueled by the density of terrified guests. In the chaos, medical personnel were quickly overwhelmed. The makeshift medical tents in Frontierland were flooded with guests showing symptoms, but no treatment seemed to work. Fever turned to rage, and rage turned to violence. As screams echoed through the park, one thing became clear. This was not a riot or a random act of terror. This was a perfect storm, and it was only getting worse. In those critical early hours, Disneyland's security team faced an impossible task. With no precedent for what was unfolding, they misjudged the crisis as a large-scale riot. Their response, meant to calm the situation, only added to the chaos. Instead of immediate evacuation, security attempted to cordon off the western quadrant of the park. This created bottlenecks and delayed the escape of thousands of guests. By the time they realized the scale of the threat, the infection had spread to every corner of the park. Delays in communication compounded the problem. Emergency responders were slow to arrive, and critical decisions came too late. What could have been a chance to contain the outbreak became a fatal misstep that doomed thousands. This is the tragedy of inaction, hesitation in the face of the unknown. And now the price of that hesitation is being paid in blood. As the scope of the disaster became clear, the government took swift and drastic action. Disneyland was placed under an immediate quarantine, with all exits barricaded by military personnel. Helicopters circled the park, enforcing a strict no-fly zone. The Centers for Disease Control issued a Level 5 biohazard alert, signaling a crisis of the highest magnitude. Inside the park, survivors were left to fend for themselves as containment units focused on preventing the infection from escaping. The happiest place on earth had become a fortress of fear, sealed off from the world and from hope. As the crisis unfolded, the rest of the world watched in stunned horror. Social media erupted with live footage of the chaos. Hashtags like Zombie Disneyland and Escape the Magic trended worldwide, fueling speculation and fear. Across the globe, one question echoed: could this nightmare spread beyond the gates? Disneyland, once a sprawling haven of magic and laughter, is now a fractured battlefield. Within hours of the outbreak, the park splintered into zones, some teeming with the infected, others fortified by desperate survivors clinging to hope. The familiar charm of Adventureland and Frontierland has been replaced by chaos. Witnesses describe these areas as war zones, filled with relentless screams, overturned stalls, and abandoned belongings. But amidst the chaos, glimmers of resistance have emerged. Tomorrowland and Main Street, USA, have become makeshift sanctuaries. Survivors have erected barriers using tables, carts, and anything they could find. Emergency supplies are rationed sparingly, with food and water running low. Every corner holds the potential for danger, as infected guests continue to infiltrate even the most secure zones. Survivors report feeling trapped, suffocated by the overwhelming odds. Communication between zones is sporadic and with no clear evacuation plan. Fear and desperation grow by the minute. The once enchanting park now operates under an unspoken rule. You're either in a safe zone or you're as good as dead. Yet, even in safety, there is no comfort. Each survivor knows they're living on borrowed time, and the next breach could be their last. Disneyland has been divided, not by fun and fantasy, but by the stark lines between survival and despair. The landmarks of Disneyland, once symbols of joy and wonder, now stand as eerie reminders of what has been lost. Cinderella's castle looms in the distance, its sparkling spires now ominous against a blood-red sky. Survivors have taken refuge within, barricading the once inviting entrances with anything they could find: benches, signage, even the remnants of broken rides. Adventureland's lush greenery, once a haven of exploration, now conceals lurking dangers. Survivors speak of shadowy figures emerging from the jungle-themed attractions, their movements unsettlingly silent until they strike. The rivers of the Jungle Cruise have turned murky, their depths rumored to hide horrors no one dares confirm. Every corner of the park tells a new story of despair. The haunted mansion is no longer an attraction, but a tomb, with dozens of infected trapped inside, their groans carrying through the air. Even the iconic Main Street, USA, with its charming storefronts and nostalgic decor, feels haunted. Its cobblestone paths stained with the signs of hurried escapes and bitter fights for survival. This is no longer Disneyland as the world remembers it. It is a shell, a twisted version of its former self, where shadows stretch longer and silence is broken only by the cries of the desperate and the relentless moans of the infected. In the face of unimaginable horror, a small group of survivors has formed a fragile alliance. These individuals, strangers only hours ago, now depend on one another for survival. Laura, a resourceful park employee in her mid-20s, has taken the role of an impromptu leader. Her deep knowledge of Disneyland's layout and backstage access points has already saved countless lives. Calm under pressure and fiercely determined, she is a beacon of hope for those around her. Mike, a father of two, carries the weight of guilt and desperation. He brought his children to Disneyland for a weekend escape, only to see their lives turned upside down. Though separated from his kids during the initial chaos, Mike's singular focus is finding them again, no matter the cost. Dr. Ellie Tanaka, a virologist with the CDC, happened to be in the park when the outbreak began. Equipped with scientific expertise and a determination to find answers, she works tirelessly to collect samples and analyze the infection, hoping to uncover a cure. Finally, there's Mason, a rebellious teenager who stumbled into the park with friends, armed only with his smartphone. His instinct to live stream the events has unintentionally become a lifeline for others as his videos reveal critical insights into the infected's behavior. Together, this unlikely group faces the impossible, surviving the horrors of the park, battling the infected, and navigating the ever-growing threats both outside and within. Trust is fragile, but it's their only weapon in a world where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. Yet, as tensions rise and resources dwindle, one question lingers. Can this alliance hold, or will the weight of survival tear them apart? Even as the infected spread terror through DisneyLand, another danger loomed, one that preyed on the survivors themselves. With every scream and every crash, the park's infrastructure began to crumble under the weight of chaos. Power surges flickered through the attractions, triggering sporadic shutdowns and malfunctioning rides. The once magical carousel, now eerily spinning without music, became a symbol of Disneyland's descent into madness. Amid this chaos, survivors found themselves divided, some by choice, others by sheer chance. Groups desperate to escape ignored the pleas of others, trampling over those who fell behind. Crowds surged toward what they thought were exits, only to find gates locked and security barriers blocking their way. The screams of the trapped mixed with the groans of the infected, creating a cacophony that echoed across the park. Laura's group, still holding together, was tested to their limits when their path through Fantasyland was suddenly cut off. A collapsing bridge near the It's a Small World attraction sent panicked families scrambling in all directions. Laura urged her group to stay calm, but Mike, driven by the desperate need to find his children, broke away. Dr. Ellie Tanaka, with her scientific precision, noted an unsettling pattern. The infected weren't just attacking randomly anymore. They were converging in certain areas, as if drawn to the panic itself. Meanwhile, Mason, still clutching his phone, captured a horrifying scene. Survivors fighting each other over dwindling supplies. A man shoved another off a ledge just to grab a single water bottle. This was chaos within chaos. Threats not just from the infected, but from the crumbling infrastructure and the survivors' own desperation. And yet, amidst it all, a chilling realization began to take shape. The infected weren't the only ones evolving. Humanity itself was splintering under the weight of fear. As Laura's group pressed forward, every step brought new dangers, and then they noticed something that stopped them cold, a distant but unmistakable sound. It wasn't the groans of the infected or the cries of the panicked. It was footsteps, measured, deliberate, and terrifyingly close. What followed defied all understanding of the infected. These creatures, once thought to be mindless, began displaying alarming signs of coordination. Survivors in Tomorrowland reported groups of infected working together to block escape routes. They surrounded barricades, not in the erratic frenzy seen earlier, but with a calculated persistence that unnerved even the bravest among them. Dr. Ellie Tanaka, always observing, began to piece together a horrifying theory. She noted that the infected responded more aggressively to heightened noise and movement, but it wasn't just instinct. They seemed to communicate. Mason's live stream captured a chilling moment. A group of infected suddenly stopped chasing one group of survivors and turned toward a new sound, almost as if signaled. "They're adapting," Ellie murmured, her voice barely audible over the chaos. The realization sent shockwaves through the group. If the infected could strategize, could anticipate, then every assumption they'd made about survival was wrong. Laura and the others had no time to debate the implications. As they moved toward their next safe zone, They noticed the infected closing in from multiple directions. Their movements weren't random. They were cutting off every escape route. With no choice but to push forward, the group made a frantic dash for the safety of an old maintenance corridor. The infected, now eerily quiet, followed with a terrifying purpose, and as the survivors slammed the door shut behind them, one thought lingered in the air. This was no longer a battle of strength. It was a battle of wits. Just as the survivors caught their breath, a crackling sound filled the air. The emergency radio they'd been carrying sputtered to life. "This is an urgent message to all remaining personnel," the voice announced, trembling with fear. "The infection is evolving. Do not let them bite you, but above all, do not let them see you. Repeat, do not let them see you." In the silence that followed, one truth became clear. The rules of survival had changed, and for those still alive, the nightmare was far from over. The survivors of Disneyland had clung to Tomorrowland as their sanctuary. It was a beacon of fleeting hope in a world collapsing into chaos. For hours, they had fortified themselves behind makeshift barriers, repurposing park props and furniture to keep the infected at bay. But in the end, the walls couldn't hold. It started as a distant thrum, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down the spines of everyone inside. Then came the banging, relentless and rhythmic. The infected had found them. Despite their frantic efforts to brace the barricades, cracks began to show, both in their defenses and their resolve. Laura, ever the determined leader, rallied the group. "Stick together. No one gets left behind," she urged, her voice cutting through the rising panic. But as the barriers gave way, chaos erupted. The infected poured in like a flood, their ravenous hunger palpable. Dr. Ellie Tanaka clutched her medical supplies, her mind racing for answers even as her body screamed for escape. Mason, phone in hand, live-streamed the chaos, capturing the group's frantic retreat as they scattered into the darkness. And Mike, still haunted by the absence of his children, threw himself into the fray, desperately buying time for others to escape. Out in the open, Tomorrowland transformed into a battlefield. Rides malfunctioned, sparking and spinning out of control, adding to the terror. The survivors were forced to navigate a maze of collapsing structures and advancing infected. As they regrouped near the edge of the safe zone, Laura looked back, her face etched with determination. "We can't stop here. Keep moving," she commanded. The sanctuary was gone. Now they faced the unknown. An endless stretch of infected-filled chaos with no safe harbor in sight. As the survivors fled deeper into the park, Mason's live stream provided an unexpected revelation. His footage showed that the infected weren't just attacking randomly. They were responding to light and sound. Fireworks, still sporadically launching into the night sky, drew clusters of infected like moths to a flame. Loud footsteps, panicked screams, even the hum of a working generator. These were beacons of death. "Turn off your lights. Stay quiet," Mason whispered urgently, his voice barely audible. His audience, now numbering in the thousands, watched in horrified fascination as he and the others moved through suffocating darkness. Dr. Tanaka confirmed Mason's findings. "It's sensory-driven," she said softly, her mind piecing together the puzzle. "Their heightened aggression comes from stimulation. Light and noise make them faster." The group's escape turned into a perilous game of silence. Laura led the way, navigating by memory and intuition, while the others followed in terrified quiet. Every step was measured, every breath held. And yet, the infected seemed to sense their presence, their guttural moans echoing ominously nearby. At one point, Mason's phone emitted a faint chime, a notification he had forgotten to silence. The sound cut through the darkness like a scream. The infected turned instantly, their heads snapping toward the noise. The group froze, hearts pounding, as shadows closed in. And then, as if by some miracle, the infected veered toward another distant sound. A collapsing structure. "We're not out of this yet," Laura muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. She was right. The rules of survival had changed, and silence had become their only shield. With each passing moment, the infected were changing. What began as erratic, mindless aggression was now something far more terrifying. Dr. Ellie Tanaka, studying the infected from what little distance safety allowed, made a grim discovery. "It's not random," she explained to the group. "Their strength, their speed, it's tied to adrenaline." She theorized that the infection didn't just attack the body, but hijacked it, pushing its victims into an almost superhuman state. When threatened, their adrenaline surged, fueling their frenzied movements and amplifying their endurance. This wasn't just an infection, it was a predator's evolution. Mason, still documenting their ordeal, captured one chilling moment. An infected man, running at full speed, slammed into a barricade and shattered it on impact. The strength was inhuman, the determination unstoppable. "They're adapting faster than we can react," Ellie admitted, her voice tinged with despair. Laura, however, refused to give up. "Then we adapt too," she said firmly. "We can't afford to lose hope." The group's movements became even more cautious. Every step a calculated risk. But the infected weren't giving them the luxury of time. Their movements became more coordinated, their responses unnervingly precise. The survivors had faced danger before, but now they faced something entirely new. An enemy that wasn't just relentless, it was evolving. And with every heartbeat, every surge of fear, the infected only grew deadlier. The question wasn't just whether they could escape, but whether they could keep up with a threat that seemed one step ahead. The survivors, now fractured and desperate, found themselves cornered with nowhere to run but deeper into the belly of the beast. Space Mountain, once a beloved thrill ride, its twisting tunnels and eerie lighting now served as a nightmarish maze. Laura, leading the group, hesitated only briefly at the entrance. "This is the only way," she said, her voice resolute but lined with unease. As they stepped inside, the darkness swallowed them whole, broken only by disorienting flashes of strobe lights. Each burst of light painted a new, horrifying picture. Shambling infected closing in, their shadows stretching grotesquely across the curved walls. The ride's ambient soundtrack, now warped and glitching, added a surreal layer to the terror. Dr. Ellie Tanaka clutched her backpack tightly, her mind racing with the stakes of their mission. The sample she carried could hold the key to understanding the infection, but every step through the narrow corridors felt like walking a razor's edge. Then, the unthinkable happened. A guttural growl erupted behind them, and Mason's camera caught the flash of an infected figure barreling toward the group. "Run!" Laura shouted, her voice slicing through the oppressive hum of the ride's systems. The survivors sprinted, weaving through the labyrinthine tunnels as the infected closed in. Each strobe revealed new dangers, fallen debris, sparking wires, and the ever-approaching horde. Mike stumbled, his breathing ragged, but Laura yanked him to his feet, refusing to let him fall behind. They reached the loading bay, only to find it swarming with infected. Mason's live stream captured the chaos as Laura screamed, "This way!" and led the group down a maintenance corridor. The narrow escape left them shaken, but alive. Yet, as the echoes of their footsteps faded, a new sound emerged. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. The infected weren't giving up, and the strobe-lit gauntlet was far from over. Dr. Ellie Tanaka knew the stakes better than anyone. The infected were evolving, and her research could provide answers, if she lived long enough to share it. But the critical data she needed was still locked inside a lab deep within the park, a lab now teeming with infected. "We have to go back," Ellie insisted, her voice shaking but determined. Laura's expression darkened as she glanced at the others. "It's suicide," she said, but she knew they had no choice. The group made their way toward the lab, using maintenance corridors to avoid the infected. Tension hung heavy in the air as every creak of the floorboards and every distant moan reminded them of the danger closing in. Reaching the lab, they found the doors ajar, the interior bathed in flickering emergency lights. The infected were everywhere, their grotesque forms stumbling between overturned desks and shattered equipment. Ellie's hands trembled as she whispered, "We need the samples from the freezer unit. It's the only way." Laura and Mason created a diversion, smashing a vending machine to lure the infected away. The plan worked. Briefly, Ellie dashed to the freezer, her fingers fumbling with the controls as the infected turned back toward her. "Hurry!" Mason yelled, swinging a broken chair leg to hold them off. Ellie retrieved the samples, but as the group began their escape, an infected lunged at Mike, dragging him to the floor. Laura intervened, her face etched with anguish as she shouted, "Go! We'll hold them!" They escaped with the samples, but the cost was devastating. Ellie's breath hitched as she realized how much had been sacrificed. The cure's key was in her hands, but at what price? Cornered and exhausted, the survivors found themselves backed against the iconic Matterhorn ride. With the infected closing in from all sides, it became clear that there was no escape. Only one last stand. "We hold them here," Laura declared, her voice cutting through the rising panic. She began organizing the group, scavenging anything they could use as weapons. Broken railings, ride parts, even shards of glass. Mason, his camera still rolling, muttered, "If we die here, the world will see how." The infected came in waves, their grotesque forms surging up the narrow paths of the Matterhorn. Laura fought with ferocity, her makeshift weapon a jagged piece of steel. Dr. Tanaka, though not a fighter, stood her ground, using her medical kit to treat wounds as the battle raged on. Mike, wounded but determined, rallied others to form a barricade. "If this is it, we make it count!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos. Mason's live stream showed the world the bravery and desperation of those who refused to give up, even in the face of impossible odds. As the horde pressed closer, the group detonated a makeshift explosive. Fireworks scavenged from the park. The explosion lit up the night sky, scattering the infected and buying precious seconds of reprieve. But the momentary victory was bittersweet. The survivors were battered, their numbers dwindling. As dawn broke over the park, the survivors stood atop the Matterhorn, bloodied but unbroken. They had faced the impossible and survived, but they knew the fight was far from over. The infection was spreading, evolving, and the battle for humanity's future had only just begun. Amid the chaos of survival, Laura stumbled upon something that shook her to the core. An internal report buried in a manager's office deep within the park's operational hub. Its contents revealed a damning truth. Park management had been warned weeks prior about potential contamination in the exotic plants imported for the Adventureland Jungle Expedition. The memo, marked as urgent, outlined the risk of fungal spores crossing species lines. However, instead of acting, management chose to ignore the warnings, prioritizing ticket sales and keeping the park operational. Laura's hands shook as she read the final line of the report. "The risk to guests is negligible. Proceed as planned." She shared the discovery with Dr. Ellie Tanaka, whose expression darkened. "This wasn't just an accident," Ellie murmured. "It was negligence." The betrayal cut deep, fueling anger among the survivors. They weren't just fighting an infection. They were victims of greed. But there was no time to dwell. Outside the office, the infected were closing in. "We can't stay here," Laura said, her voice laced with determination. As they prepared to move, one thought lingered in her mind. The truth must come out, but would anyone live to share it? Mike had been driven by a singular purpose since the chaos began, finding his children. Every step, every breath was for them. And when the moment came, he didn't hesitate to make the ultimate sacrifice. The group was ambushed as they crossed a narrow passage, the infected surging toward them like a tidal wave. In the chaos, one of Mike's children stumbled, falling behind. Without a second thought, Mike turned back, placing himself between the horde and his son. "Go!" he shouted, his voice fierce and unyielding. His son's tears mixed with the dirt on his face as Laura dragged him away. Mike fought with everything he had, wielding an improvised weapon against the relentless swarm. His final moments were a blur of screams and determination as he gave his life to buy the others precious seconds to escape. When the group regrouped, silence hung heavy in the air. Mike's son clutched Laura's hand, his small frame trembling. He saved me," the boy whispered, his voice breaking. Mike's sacrifice wasn't just a tragedy. It was a symbol of love, resilience, and the lengths a parent would go to protect their child. And in that moment, the survivors knew they had to honor his memory by making it out alive. Survivors had long believed the infected were mindless, driven solely by hunger, but what unfolded next shattered that assumption entirely. As Laura led the group toward a supposed escape route near the park's outer edge, they found themselves funneled into a narrow alley between attractions. It seemed too quiet, too easy. Then came the trap. From above, infected poured down from an abandoned roller coaster, while others blocked the exits. It wasn't random. It was coordinated. "Doctor," Ellie Tanaka's voice trembled. "They're learning," she said, the weight of her words sinking in. The infected weren't just evolving physically. They were strategizing. The survivors fought desperately, their improvised weapons barely holding the swarm at bay. Mason, still live-streaming, captured the terrifying precision of the ambush. "They drove us here," Laura realized, her voice filled with horror. They knew we'd come this way. Using every ounce of strength and ingenuity, the group managed to break free, but not without cost. Their supplies were scattered, and their hope was shaken. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was a battle against an enemy growing smarter by the second. And the question loomed, how much smarter could they get? With the infected closing in from all sides, the survivors made a desperate plan. Use the park's fireworks launch platform as both a distraction and a weapon. "If we time it right," Laura said, her voice steady despite the chaos, "we can draw them away long enough to make a run for it." The group worked frantically, wiring the launch system to create an improvised explosive. Mason, still clutching his phone, set up the live stream to capture the event. "If we go down," he said, "the world will know what happened here." As the fireworks ignited, the night sky exploded in a dazzling display of color and sound. The infected, drawn by the spectacle, swarmed toward the platform, but as they reached it, the survivors detonated their makeshift bomb, creating a massive explosion that rocked the park. Smoke and fire engulfed the area, scattering the infected and clearing a path for escape. The survivors, bloodied and exhausted, ran through the chaos, their hearts pounding with both fear and hope. Behind them, the fireworks continued to light the sky, a symbol of defiance, a fleeting moment of beauty in a world gone dark. For now, they had survived, but the fight was far from over. The survivors emerged from the ruins of DisneyLand into a world that felt both eerily silent and oppressively vast. For hours, they had fought through chaos, dodged death, and witnessed unspeakable horrors. Now, as dawn painted the sky in muted hues of gray and orange, they stood together, scarred, battered, but alive. Laura led the group, her eyes scanning the horizon with a determination that belied her exhaustion. Every step they took felt heavy, not just from fatigue, but from the weight of those they had lost. The park's once familiar landmarks now appeared like broken relics, reminders of the nightmare they had narrowly escaped. Mike's absence loomed large. His son walked beside Laura, clutching her hand tightly, as if afraid to let go. His silent tears cut through the group's weary resolve, a painful reminder of the sacrifices that had been made. Dr. Ellie Tanaka carried her samples like a lifeline. The weight of the cure, or at least the hope of one, rested squarely on her shoulders. She had seen the infection up close, studied its rapid evolution, and knew that time was running out. "We can't stop here," she said softly. "The world needs answers." As they moved further from the park's crumbling gates, Mason hesitated. He glanced back, his phone still in hand, the screen dark now, but holding countless recordings of their ordeal. "The world will see this," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The group pressed on, their surroundings eerily quiet, the only sounds their labored breathing, and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Though they had survived the nightmare of DisneyLand, a new question lingered. What kind of world awaited them beyond its gates? And was it a world they could still save? For Dr. Ellie Tanaka, survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about finding answers. Clutched tightly in her hands were the samples she had risked everything to retrieve. Fragments of the infection that might hold the key to humanity's survival. The survivors found temporary refuge in an abandoned service station, just beyond the park's perimeter. It was a moment of respite, but Ellie's focus never wavered. She quickly unpacked her equipment, her hands moving with practiced precision, despite their trembling. "The mutation is accelerating," Ellie explained to Laura as she analyzed the samples. "If we can understand how it spreads, we might be able to stop it, or at least slow it down." Laura nodded, her expression a mix of hope and exhaustion. "And if we don't?" Ellie hesitated, her gaze dropping to the microscope in front of her. "If we don't, it won't just be Disneyland. It'll be everywhere." With a makeshift transmitter scavenged from the service station, Ellie sent her findings to the nearest CDC outpost. Every second felt like an eternity as she waited for confirmation that the data had been received. Finally, a crackling response came through. "We've got it. Good work. But stay vigilant. The infection is spreading faster than anticipated." It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a beginning. Ellie had lit a small flame of hope in a world drowning in darkness. But even as she packed up her equipment, she knew the road ahead would only get harder. Survival always comes at a cost. For Laura and the others, that cost weighed heavily on their minds and hearts as they continued their journey. Each step away from Disneyland felt like both a victory and a betrayal of those who hadn't made it out. Mike's son clung tightly to Laura's hand, his small frame trembling with the weight of grief far beyond his years. Every time Laura looked at him, she felt the sting of Mike's sacrifice. "He gave us a chance," she reminded herself, but the words offered little comfort. Mason walked silently behind the group, his usual sarcastic demeanor replaced by a grim focus. His phone, once a tool of documentation, now felt like a heavy burden. He had captured everything, the terror, the sacrifices, the raw humanity of survival. And yet, he wondered, would sharing it make a difference, or was it just a painful reminder of all they had endured? Doctor. Tanaka, carrying the hope of a cure, bore her own guilt. She had witnessed the infection's horrors up close, seen its victims transform, and understood the urgency of her mission. But she couldn't shake the faces of those she couldn't save. "We've made it this far," Laura said finally, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "We owe it to them, to everyone, to keep going." They walked on, their destination uncertain, but their purpose clear. Each survivor carried their own scars, physical, emotional, and invisible. And though the road ahead was fraught with danger, they knew they had no choice but to face it. After all, survival wasn't just about living. It was about making their survival mean something. The world thought the nightmare was over. As the survivors of Disneyland made their way to safety, a broadcast began to circulate, sent from an unverified source. The grainy footage showed the park, now a graveyard of shattered dreams and silent rides. But amidst the ruins, something stirred. A lone infected child wandered the deserted pathways of Fantasyland, its movement slow and jerky. as though its body struggled against its twisted nature. Dressed in a Mickey Mouse t-shirt, now torn and blood-stained, the child's hollow eyes scanned the empty surroundings. It paused near the carousel, tilting its head as if listening to something only it could hear. The scene was haunting in its simplicity, a reminder that while the survivors had escaped, the infection remained, festering in the park's darkened corners. As the camera zoomed in, the child turned suddenly, its gaze locking onto the viewer with unsettling precision. The footage cut off abruptly, leaving behind only static. Across the world, those who saw it were left with the same question. Was the infection truly contained? Or was this child just the beginning of something far worse? This is an emergency broadcast from the National Crisis Response Network. The DisneyLand outbreak has been officially contained, but the danger is far from over. We urge all citizens within 50 miles of Anaheim to remain indoors and avoid travel to the area. Do not approach the park perimeter, and under no circumstances should you attempt to enter the quarantine zone. Military forces remain on high alert to enforce containment protocols. While efforts are underway to understand and combat the infection, vigilance is critical. Reports suggest the infected may exhibit behaviors beyond initial observations. They are drawn to sound, light, and movement. Do not let your guard down. To survivors of the outbreak, your courage has not gone unnoticed. The data retrieved by Dr. Ellie Tanaka has been instrumental in advancing our understanding of the infection. However, there is much work to be done. This is not the end, but a turning point. Humanity must stand together, prepared for the challenges ahead. Remember, stay alert, stay informed, and above all, stay safe. As the broadcast fades, a faint sound emerges, barely audible against the static. A whisper. It's distorted, almost inhuman, yet unmistakably deliberate. They're not all gone, the voice rasps, chilling in its simplicity. The transmission cuts out entirely, leaving only silence in its wake. Across the world, those listening are left with an unshakable sense of dread. Was it a warning? A taunt? Or something far worse? One thing is clear. The nightmare isn't over, and the shadows still hold secrets, waiting to be unleashed. If you've listened to this radio broadcast all the way to the end, thank you for joining us. Your support means everything to us. To help us continue bringing you immersive and engaging broadcasts like this on a daily basis, consider joining our channel by clicking on the Join button. Stay connected with us for daily video updates and be part of our growing community by subscribing to our channel. If you have any suggestions or feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comment box below. And if you enjoyed this broadcast, please don't forget to like and share this video. Your support helps us reach more listeners and keeps us motivated to bring you the best content every day. Stay safe, stay informed, and until next time, thank you for being with us.